Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in today. We're from all over. This is truly a global town hall. I saw some representation from all over North America, Canada, Dallas, Boston, LA, but I also saw some Switzerland in there. So this is global, and we're going to make it even more global. I don't know what that is. Universal. We'll see. But thank you everyone for being here today. We are currently at about 450 attendees and we have some music playing in the background. We're just also excited. So thank you for joining us. We're going to start out with some acknowledgements as folks continue to join us. So wherever you're at, we're just going to settle down and create a foundation for the conversation that we're going to be having today. So first, we'd really like to do an acknowledgement of the land. And we'd like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this land. We want to acknowledge specifically the Duwamish and Snohomish peoples on whose land the CCF group occupies. These people are not only the first stewards of this land in which we work, live, and build community, they are still here. This acknowledgement doesn't take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but does serve as a first step in honoring the land we are on and in honoring the people. I would like you all to take this time to identify the native lands on which you occupy. There are some folks who are already doing that as well. I saw some Hopi and Diné. Yes, thank you, Lakota. If you don't know what the name of the tribal land you are on, I recommend figuring that out. In the chat, it might have already been passed because there's a lot of people entering and recognizing the lands that they're on. But if you want to find out, I recommend going to native-land.ca. That will let you know what land you're currently occupying. You can put in a zip code or a town. And additionally, if you are in the greater Seattle area, I recommend checking out realrentduwamish.org. This is a way for us to pay rent to the Duwamish people on whose land we are on. So that link will also be available in the chat, and this is a small step away from erasure toward decolonization, recognizing the Indigenous communities who are still here. We'd also like to take the time to acknowledge our ancestors and invite our ancestors into this space. Those ancestors who are still living and the ancestors who are past. We acknowledge that the work that we are doing today in this moment and in this movement is possible because of those who came before us. So to the ancestors, we are grateful, and because of the ancestors, we can continue this work. And finally, we'd like to acknowledge that we're living in a tumultuous time. We're living in a double pandemic. There are two viruses that are infecting our communities, COVID and racism, and we are living in the midst of a rapidly changing world and a sustained uprising for Black lives. We want to thank those doing the work locally here in Seattle at Decriminalize Seattle and others who are working tirelessly to defund the police in Seattle. And we want to thank COVID-19 Mutual Aid, who are working to redistribute resources in communities most affected by COVID. And those are our Black and Brown communities. So in this moment of transformational change, I'm excited to introduce James, who will be chatting with some amazing fundraisers and nonprofit professionals. James is one of the leaders of Community-Centric fundraising here in Seattle. He is the former executive director at Vietnamese Friendship Association, now known as Candelia, and is currently with the Nature Conservancy. So please help me welcoming James and the rest of the panelists.
Hey everyone, thanks for that introduction, Rebecca. Yeah, so I've been fundraising, I think, for over 10 years now, and I started when I was 7. At that time, I was asking my parents for an allowance And they gave it to me. And I've, come to learn that what we call that is like monthly, annual, recurring gift. So I started quite young. So I'm joined today by some really wonderful panelists who are going to engage in a conversation around community-centric fundraising and really exploring racism and philanthropy. So I'd like to start by introducing my friend Michelle Murray, who is a fundraising consultant and founded Freedom Conspiracy, and is now the new host of The Ethical Rainmaker, a podcast, which you should tune into. So welcome, Michelle. We also have Marissa DeSouls, who is a Sacramento-based fundraiser and one of the first contributors to CCF with her post, 12 Years of Fly in the Milk, which is an amazing video if you haven't watched it. I'm also joined by Erica Chen, who is a Seattle activist and co-founder for CCF. And she's contributed a couple pieces to our blog, including 10 reasons why fundraisers and nonprofits need to support defunding the police, and what I learned from losing 2 jobs in the fight for racial equity. So thank you and welcome, Erica. We also are joined by Hillary Giovanni, a community organizer and philanthropist who contributed an upcoming blog post about reparations and repaying an unpayable debt. And finally, with Elisa Schoenberger, who is a journalist, prospect researcher, and data analyst who has written numerous topics examining philanthropy. So welcome everyone. I hope you are ready, and let's get off of mute so we can have a conversation. So first, I'd like to thank everyone just for your time and contributions to our community. And I'll open with the question, what compelled you to be involved with community-centric fundraising and contribute to our blog? Could you kind of lead us off, Marissa?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thanks, James. So the story for my piece is I actually wrote it well before I heard anything about CCF. And I had put the whole George Floyd thing was happening, and I put a picture of my son who, inspired the piece on Facebook. And I was really dismayed by the response or lack thereof from people that I had, considered kind of work friends or whatever. And I had to sit down and write it because I felt like I was going to explode if I didn't. And I had zero intention of publishing it or putting it anywhere or showing it to anybody because obviously, but I wrote it and I just walked away from it and was like, wow, that felt good to get that out. I'm so glad. Didn't think about it again until email landed in my inbox from Boulay talking about this new thing and that they wanted content and they wanted to amplify voices like mine. And I'm like, what? So I gathered up all the chutzpah I had in me and I threw it in an email, and amazingly, they liked it, and things went from there. And I originally just wrote it as a written piece, and then I saw that they were also looking for video, and I thought, well, maybe I could just say it, which turned out to be a lot harder than I thought and was almost impossible. In fact, I don't think I could have gotten through the video if it weren't for the fact that my son was videographing. And it still took me a few tries and a couple of almost vomitings. But I got through it, and I was able to put it out there, and it's probably the best thing I've ever done.
Thanks for sharing that. It's really great to just hear that background of kind of what moved you toward the piece that you had. How about any of our other panelists? Like what motivated you for your contributions?
I can hop in, I guess. My 2 contributions, the first one I wrote about why fundraisers and nonprofits should support defunding the police. That kind of just came pouring out of me. It was something I was actually working on. I'm actually a board member for the local AFP chapter here in Seattle. And I wrote it with the hopes that they would support it. I also had a fear that they might not. So I had this like, well, I'm just going to write it because it's just in me and it needs to come out. And if AFP won't support it, then I know CCF will. luckily, actually, the rest of the board voted and it was approved. So we did send it out as the Advancement Northwest chapter here, which I was like pleasantly shocked that they did support it. But I still wanted to publish it on CCF because I thought it was, there is this movement here in Seattle that is making headway. There's votes happening last week. Today, there's more votes happening in City Council. But I think this is defunding the police is bigger than just Seattle, right? It's nationwide. So I wanted to make sure that that got out in our CCF movement as well. For my other piece, actually, our web designer, graphic designer, just person extraordinaire, Stacy, on one of our original just like mock-ups of our website, had just some like random like titles that she had created for not real articles on the website, and one of them was about, it was something about losing a job to I forget what it was, but it was about losing a job to realize harmful fundraising practices. And when I saw that she had written that fake title, I was like, oh my God, I need to write that article. And that was the same. That was just these stories I've had inside of me, and I tell to like job interviews and people that ask me about my work history. I'm always really honest about my work history. But I knew I had wanted to do something more with it. And same thing with that piece, it needed to come out and I wanted it to be more constructive. I have been able to process a lot of the like emotions I have around losing these jobs. But I wanted to make sure that the piece not only had that emotion, but really also had like actionable things, so other people who have experienced this or want to prevent this from happening to other people could really take away.
Oh, thank you, Erica. So Michelle, you recently launched a podcast to explore some of these themes more deeply. Can you share at all?
Yeah, of course, I'd love to. Yeah, so I've been a fundraiser for 15 years, and one of the things that I realized over time is actually how much power we have, which is why I wrote that my first blog post ever about the power that we have, where we're really in the center as fundraisers. And often we don't talk about ourselves like we have that power, but we have so much influence with every constituency that a nonprofit touches, almost every constituency. And hopefully, if we're from the community that we're serving, then it's every constituency. So we really have a lot of power, but we often pretend that we don't, or we don't leverage it, or we're not cognizant of it. And so, yeah, I really wanted to contribute that piece. It also, like Erica was describing, it flowed out of me one night. I wasn't necessarily planning on writing it. But I think when a piece is ready, it just like comes out. And that was a powerful experience. And I feel really passionately about that we actually have a lot of change that we can make. I worked with Edgar Villanueva for about 1.5 years as he was launching Decolonizing Wealth. And I met a lot of philanthropists who the focus was on philanthropy and how philanthropy itself can be different. But I've always thought about fundraisers in that picture too. There are a lot of roles that we can play. One of my upcoming podcasts will actually be with somebody that comes from the world of kink. And I'm going to be talking to them about consent and how the concepts of consent should actually be applied in many situations, including in philanthropy and nonprofits. And we, in consensual relationships, get to negotiate what those relationships are like. And so that's part of why I started the podcast, is to explore. It's hard to go from, I'm a successful fundraiser doing great for this organization I care a lot about, and I feel like there are some things I don't love about it, but like I'm doing my best. It's hard to go from that to like burn it all down, the whole system is whack. I feel like some of us need to really be like led along a path of more information so that we can make our own informed decisions about how we move forward in changing. No doubt things need to be changed, but I wanted to create the podcast in order to have a platform where we could learn more from people who are doing things differently, or exploring different ways of doing things in our sector so that we can move forward. So that was my inspiration. Thank you.
Thanks. And now I'd love to just hear from Hillary or Elisa, if one of you would like to jump in and again, share what kind of motivated the two of you to contribute.
Hi, yeah, I can jump in. My name is Hillary. I'm living on Dene, Hopi, and Havasupai land in northern Arizona. And what prompted my writing my piece, which is about reparative philanthropy, was really my ancestors. My ancestors have been kind of leading a process over the last 5 years that I've discovered. And it started when I kind of unwittingly stumbled upon a book of family genealogy that my great uncle had written more than 20 years ago. And in that book, I discovered that I'm a 9th generation settler and that I had ancestors who received grants of stolen land and ancestors who enslaved people. And when I read that, it was, it was sickening, it was shocking, it was a surprise, and it kind of instigated this, identity crisis and a crisis on many levels. And so I started really investigating colonialism and white supremacy and money and power and my relationships with those things. And I started to write a book about it. And so the piece that I submitted for your blog is a modified excerpt out of my book. And I just really appreciate the opportunity to be included because I'm super resonant with your principles and what you guys are doing. So thank you for the opportunity.
Hi, I'm Elisa Schoenberger. I'm in Chicago, so I want to recognize I'm on Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, and Siouxland. So I've worked as a prospect researcher for many years, and this kind of came out of three sort of ideas that combined at the same time. The first was, for the last several years, we've been talking a lot about women in philanthropy and how women give differently than men. But it was a realization that, a lot of times we're talking about white women and white men, and talking about, how do other groups give and what patterns and how are we not making philanthropy inclusive for non-white men. So we've been, that sort of was the first thing. I read Vule's article about, white supremacy and fundraising. And at that time I was working on an article, I'm a journalist as well as a prospect researcher, on equity and diversity in publishing, especially with what had happened earlier this year with American Dirt. And it got me really started thinking, well, if this is publishing, what is it that we could be doing better in prospect research to make fundraising less racist? Or what are we doing to help perpetuate it? What can we do to stop that? So it came from those sort of three, the perfect storm of three elements.
Thanks. And I also want to highlight that we are joined by my friend Rihanna, who's the Director of Development at Launch Learning, an early learning organization here in Seattle. So Rihanna, would you like to kind of share your thoughts?
Yeah, so I actually got involved with CCF from the early days. So the organization I work for has been around for, it's 43 years now, but we were newer to fundraising. We had really been historically dependent on government contracts, fee for service, those kinds of things, but really didn't have much in the way of a fundraising grant individual giving program. So I was brought on to build a program from scratch. And so I've been in fundraising, I think 12 years now. And so I was pretty well grounded in the basics of how you do fundraising. And yet we were not seeing some of the results after a few years that we were expecting. And, we're an organization led by, at the time, all women. Half of the senior leadership team were women of color. Our ED was a Black woman. Our new ED is a Black woman. And we serve a very diverse group of families. And we were really struggling to figure out why other organizations just seem to be able to tap into support. And we were doing the same work. We had a great reputation in the sector in our area among like people who know about education, but we just couldn't seem to be getting any funding. And I'll never forget sitting there after our annual luncheon and just in tears because we didn't really raise as much money as possible as I thought was doable. And so my ED and I started reaching out to like-minded folks, to like-minded organizations, just like, what are you guys doing? What are we doing wrong? Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Because I was starting to think maybe I should just not be in fundraising. And I remember we met James. We met with James, and he was so willing to just share any kind of ideas. But what he said is, he said, you know, it's interesting that you wanted to meet, because we're actually throwing out our fundraising model, and we're rebuilding it because this model doesn't work. And it was like a light bulb went off, like, yeah, there's things that we could be doing better, but the problem isn't fully us, that there's a systemic issue. And I still remind myself what he said during that initial meeting. I think it was like three and a half years ago now. He said, I'm not trying to raise money. I'm trying to raise power in the community. And when you raise power in the community, the money will come, but it's raising power in the community. And that's really what struck me. And, you know, that's why we got involved in these initial conversations about CCF, because it really resonated with me and my ED at the time that this is what we need to be doing. And this is what makes sense for us. And I think ever since we've really intentionally started talking more about racial equity and trying to embed CCF principles in our work, we started to see the response. So.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I remember that conversation. Thanks for kind of elevating it again. So we have our first question from the audience from Elise Peterson. Elise, if you'd like to come on mute and ask, you are more than welcome to. If not, I can read it for all of the panelists here.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm so excited to just be part of all of this. I guess my question, and I don't know if it's more of a question or just like a suggestion, but I'm so excited to start really implementing a lot of the community-centric fundraising ideas and practices in the work that I do as a fundraiser here in Seattle. And one thing that I always find helpful is when I can see real-world examples. And so I wonder if anyone or a group of people would be willing to do like reviews of fundraising communications as like blog posts or something like that, so that we can both see an example of something that's really in line with this, and also even see like how you can edit something so that it could be more community-centric focused. So that's my question and suggestion. Thank you.
Ooh, sis, that sounds like a call for material from the audience. We have 621 people on with us right now, and I think that's a great idea. I think that sounds like a call for submissions.
So I guess related to that theme, does anyone in our panel have an example or something they've tried and maybe succeeded in, or even stumbled on or stumbled through?
I have seen some cool thank you letters after donations have been received. The thank you letter being edited to include at the bottom other organizations that are either like part of a partnership, coalition, or aligned missions, just to create that real community feel, right? So thank you for your donation. Check out these other organizations, whether it's to donate, volunteer, follow on social media, etc. I think I originally saw that from Justice Funders doing that work. So I probably have some examples of it somewhere buried in my email.
I've also seen some examples of great fundraising events that are done community-centric. Social Justice Fund here in Seattle does some really awesomely well thought out events that really feel community-centric and really driven by the folks that they like, well, I guess they don't do direct service, but the really incorporating their the people who contribute to their giving circles and really take the lead on the work. So I think that's a great place to look to also. And their communications in general just are fantastic.
Any other thoughts or examples to share? If not, we can jump to the next question on our.
You know, actually, I'll share real quickly. In my consulting collective, we recognize that there are no experts on community-centric fundraising who we personally know. And so we're doing a lot of things that are experimental. And my hope in the CCF platform is that for other people who are experimenting and learning what works and doesn't work, that they will contribute content to CCF and kind of exemplify for the rest of us so that we can learn from each other. I know that in some of my work right now, we're talking about pipelines and portfolios, right? Who belongs in a portfolio if you're actually trying to be community-centered? And I think questions like that start with, who is your community? Who are you trying to serve? Who cares about the folks who you're trying to serve? Who are the, and just like really building out and becoming cognizant of who your community is, and then seeing how they're reflected both on your staff and your board. And then talking about, if I build a pipeline for somebody, like for my board president, if I build a pipeline for them, should it really all be major donors? Probably not. It should probably represent community and who your community has been identified as. And then we have to look at things like the power dynamics between whatever identities that board president holds and whatever identities they're of the folks that they're going to try to talk to. So very complex and totally worth looking at, because the way that we've been doing it has been working for some well and not working for others, as Rehana's talking about. But it's even in those practices where we really have to check ourselves. And I'll definitely be coming up with content probably after our winter appeal season, right, up into early next year. But it would be great to hear from other folks in the form of contributed content around these practices.
I just love how it just, to me, everything is just so connected. Like everything Michelle just said is so connected to Elisa's piece that she wrote about prospecting. And then when I read that piece, honestly, I was reading it and I was like, this is what I was fired for from Invest in Youth. I was specifically doing that work for our volunteer pipeline to our board. I wanted to increase the diversity, and those people are our donors as well. It was just completely creating that pipeline. I was looking at smaller newspapers. I was doing everything that was in Elisa's article. Like I was doing that 3.5 years ago, and then that's what I was fired for. So yeah, that's my, we're all connected. Take yourselves off mute so you can laugh with me, please. Thank you, James.
Hillary, I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on this specific question. I think, because I've had a chance to preview your blog post, I know you have something to say about this topic, or specific examples.
Yeah. I've been doing philanthropic work for about 10 years with my husband's family, and also with just my husband and I together. And I would say one of the biggest things that I've learned is it's really important for me as a philanthropist to reach out and build relationship with people who come from different communities, and to listen and pay attention and observe and try to understand what people are dealing with. That's probably been the foundational piece of my learning. And then in recent years, it's been super exciting because we have found organizations to support us and in really changing the direction that the money is flowing, and really intentionally directing that into BIPOC-led work and BIPOC communities. So 3 of the areas where we're focusing right now is we're focusing on participatory grant making, And we're working with a specific circle that will be taking place in Mississippi this year with Black-led organizations doing community work with their community. We're working with an Indigenous Women's Flow Fund through the Kindle Project. And then we're also working with some regranting organizations, including Liberated Capital, Edgar's.
Yeah.
Yep. And also Seventh Generation Fund and Medicine Theory. So it's been exciting to me to realize and recognize that letting go of the power making, the decision-making power is super important. And it's also very liberating and freeing to let go of the illusion that I'm supposed to know what's going on because I don't know. And so I'm grateful for those groups who are doing that work and giving the opportunity to start moving money in different ways.
Thank you. So we have another question from the audience. This one was upvoted and it's anonymous. So I'll read it to everyone. And it reads, I'd love to hear about the strategies you've used to lead courageous conversations about centering equity within your development teams, particularly if your team is steeped in old white supremacy practices and ideas. So anyone have any thoughts on that?
A difficult one for me to answer because I am a small development team. It's me and my ED. And I have an assistant who's 15 hours a week. So, and we are all women of color. So, yeah, I would love to hear what some of the other panelists say because the equity has always been a topic of conversation in the jobs I've had for the last 10 years. I've been very lucky to work for organizations who are interested and willing and want to engage in these conversations. So I haven't had to push back very much internally on those things. I mean, we've had to have some conversations with board members and just explaining to them what we're trying to do and why, but it's been, we haven't had, I'm not like at a big university with a team of like 40 fundraisers that's in this very rigid model that I have to push back on. So I know that there are people here on the panel who've worked in some of those bigger organizations who can probably talk a bit about what they did. Jump all in at once.
Well, I'll say I think these conversations are really important to have, and they're difficult because in my own training as a fundraiser, we're taught to really avoid, race or gender or even politics because we don't want to upset donors and we don't want to make them uncomfortable, which is quite antithetical to a lot of our mission-based work, especially if our organizations are focused on undoing racism or focused on social equity and things like that. So it's like, it's this balance or a dissonance that we kind of hold. How do we both commit ourselves to racial equity and yet not have these bold and courageous conversations with donors? Can anyone relate to that?
I was trying to wait to see if anyone else wanted to jump in. I felt like I was talking a lot, but I think it relates a lot to the piece I wrote about losing 2 jobs in this fight for racial equity. I think I touched on it, but maybe I'm not the best person to be giving this advice because clearly I was fired or let go or left places and didn't have the successes I was hoping to see. But I think what I learned from those experiences was about how this work is actually dangerous for people of color sometimes, and it's important for us to create our own coalitions within our organizations, figure out who is aligned with you, who wants to do the work, who wants to champion this diversity, equity, inclusion, access, racial equity, anti-racism, whatever you want to call it, who wants to be a part of that work, and then who is in the safer position, who's in the positions of power. How can you leverage those positions to have the most impact, and just be really cognizant of that, and if you're willing to lose your job or not over some things.
So we have a related question from the audience, from Elba Morales, and they write, I'd love to learn about how to boldly lead advocacy efforts when funders, from government contracts, may be directly opposed to systemic change. How do you stick to your mission with possible loss of major funding? Has anyone here ever kind of come face to face with that dilemma?
Yeah, I mean, so it happens at a variety of organizations. Some of my background comes from the civil legal aid arena, and I did 10 years time at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, which is an incredible organization that does direct legal services and class action litigation in the immigrant rights realm here in Washington State. But one of my current clients is Columbia Legal Services. And that organization really did a pivot a couple of years ago. And they really had to think about who they wanted to accept funding from and what systems would they be complicit in if they were accepting that funding. And as a result, they actually chose to start declining government funding. So they now accept no government contracts because their work is around dismantling the criminal, the carceral state and mass incarceration, including the plight of immigrants and refugees, especially for this particular organization, agricultural workers in Washington State. And they couldn't, in good faith, accept government funding any longer when the government is so complicit in the oppression of people and based on systemic racism itself. So I'm proud of organizations like that can say no to big chunks of funding. It really required them to do a turnaround. I believe that they shrunk a bit. Sometimes it does mean saying no to that money and working towards finding it elsewhere. That being said, there's still an organization, that particular organization, there's still an organization working within the law. And we know that our legal systems are also built on white supremacy. So they do that internal work and they're aware of it. And they consistently are addressing it so that the inherent tension in what is happening is being analyzed and looked at and discussed and processed at all times so that it's not just left on the back burner like so many organizations do. When we feel like we're desperate for funding, when we feel like we know that people will suffer if we say no to that money, but when the folks who are giving that funding aren't able to have conversations with us, like the government, for example, in this situation, that's a big beast to try to undo. I do think that, especially at this moment in time, it's an amazing moment to have those conversations with funders, to have those bold conversations, Elba. Means taking a risk, and it means possibly risking losing that money. But we have to look at also organizations who had to risk losing money. So I just read N.K. Jemison's newest book, The City We Became. It's one at the beginning of a trilogy, right? And N.K. Jemison literally talks about, has a whole, it's about a chapter, honestly, about this nonprofit and the pressure to receive a $23 million check and how their board wanted to say yes to that unrestricted money. Literally talks about this in the sci-fi book. And then, in the end, how it was absolutely not values aligned and would have really required the organization to go against everything they believed in. And in this case, it was a museum putting up white supremacist art. And I think we actually come up against those tensions a lot, and we pretend not to see them. and we try not to have those conversations. But this is a great moment to have those difficult conversations. And there are so many tools and resources, and all of our social media feeds, hopefully, are filled with information coming at us about all of us needing to re-examine the way that we look at systems. And so this is a great time.
I mean, I'd like to bring up also the recent, we're also in a really interesting moment with a lot of the pushback against, organizations that took money from Jeff Epstein and the Sackler family. So it's becoming more front and center, who should we be taking money from? So it's become, we want to, be having donors who are commiserate with our values. And one of the people I talked to for the article, it's like, there are going to be some people you're going to lose, and it's going to be terrible. Like, there's no way around it, but hopefully you're going to find people who are, interested in your values. And there are people out there who believe in your mission and want to give to your mission. It just may not, it's like the short term versus the long term. And I think that's part of, we're seeing a lot of that problem where people value the short term over the long term. But I'm not saying it won't be easy or pleasant or whatever if you lose those donors, but in the long term, hopefully you're finding the ones who are the donors you want to be, working with.
Yeah, and you can see that there are plenty of examples of that. I mean, I can't always I can't promise you that if you live your values and you turn money away, that it will magically be replaced. But we have seen plenty of instances where that has happened. So I just think about here in Western Washington, a couple years ago, the Girl Scouts of Western Washington got a $100,000 donation to their girls' summer camp. And it came with a note that said, the donor wanted to make sure that it was not, it didn't go to transgender girls. And, that was a lot of money for the Girl Scouts. That would have paid for, I want to say it paid for their camp, most of the camp that year. But they said, this is not aligned with our values. We are not an organization that will discriminate against transgender girls or anyone, and we will turn this money away. And by living those values, they went to the media. Of course, didn't name the donor, but they raised well over, I want to say it was like $1 million by turning away that $100,000. So when you say, this is who we are, these are our values, and you live them, I think donors really, they see that and they respond to that. People want to be part of something that is meaningful and that is mission driven and that is authentic and values driven. So I do think, like Elisa said, it may be a short term loss, but I think longer term, you will always come out ahead by living your values.
Thanks. So we have another question from the audience, this one from Cindy Olnick, and I'd like to invite Cindy to come off of mute and ask the panelists.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you hear me? Okay, so thank you guys for doing this. I'm blown away. I'm toward the end of my career and I've seen a lot, and I'm just so excited to see what you guys are doing. So thank you. To that end, I'm trying to foster conversations. I'm in the historic preservation field, and I'm more of a messenger than a fundraiser, more general communications. And I'm trying to get people to talk about this idea of talking about donors as partners versus saviors. And I've been on staff at a nonprofit for a long time, and I know how demoralizing it can be. So when we tell donors we couldn't do this without you, well, yeah, but they couldn't do it without us, right? So I'm all for that more of a partnership. But I'm just wondering if you have any examples of that kind of we versus you language, and if you've had pushback on it, and if you how you might have handled that. Thanks.
And this pause is for reflection, because I'm sure our panelists are really thinking about this critically. But I will say that is something that I have personally been challenged by as a fundraiser, because oftentimes when we talk about philanthropy and fundraising, it's always, you know, this idea of like making a gift to support like some other group, you know, some other community, rather than seeing it as a benefit for you and your community. You know, the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. So it's definitely something I resonate with and can relate to. So yeah, again, I'd love to hear thoughts from our panelists and how either they've been engaged or confronted with this issue and how they've addressed it, if at all.
Well, I'd like to chime in. This is not a lived experience of mine, just something I heard on NPR the other day, and it was actually a show talking about happiness and, you know, kind of the science behind happiness. And as we all know, giving causes happiness, and they were talking about different types of giving. And the host was talking about this, how, you know, obviously having some sort of tangible impact for your gift produces happiness on the part of the giver, right? But then she started talking about this program called Group of Five, I guess in Canada. And it's a philanthropy model where they bring in a refugee family. This was during the time of the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. And they have to not just raise the money for this family, they have to be a group of 5 people or 5 families. They have to not only raise the money to support them, they have to go and find them a place to live, stock it with furniture, buy food for the fridge, and go to the airport and meet them at the airport. And by the time they had done all of this, these people that they were bringing over were not those refugees or that family. They were our family. We're going to get our family at the airport. And it struck me, the change in language there. And I was like, that's bridging that gap, right? To where I'm not helping them. They are me. They are us, right?
Yeah, I really appreciate that story. And, you know, I can just speak from the perspective of being a donor, and I feel like where we really need to go as donors is coming to the realization that these resources, probably in the United States, in all cases, were built upon stolen land with stolen labor. That's the basis for our economy. And once I came to that realization, everything changed. It was no longer about me. I don't need accolades. I don't need praise. You know, I don't even need to be named, because it's really about just returning what was taken. And the act of returning what was taken allows me to restore a piece of my humanity. So it's really a gift. And I'd like to see donors moving out of that paradigm where they have to be centered and praised, because that time is over. Or it should be soon.
Yeah,
Yes.
I agree. Please.
Can I throw in just a quick follow-up? I have to say, I mean, what does COVID have to do with all this, right? Because now we have organizations saying, we won't be here next year unless we take all the money we can get. And if we're not here, we can't help anybody. Any reflections on that? And then I'll be quiet, promise.
That's why I think a hyper local approach works, right? You know, like if you're community centered, you know what choice you need to make, whatever that is. And every organization will make a different choice, right? Or maybe they will. But is there a right answer? I think that's only for an organization to decide. For my example of Columbia Legal Services, there was absolutely a right answer. It's that we cannot take money from the government, even in a time of COVID. You know, like even if, and that way their community of support can have, and the community, all their communities can have faith that the organization is not acting towards or making concessions for their relationship to the government in the legal work that they're taking on. So for that organization and that example, it was the right choice, but it may not be for everybody.
Yeah, I want to revisit something you just mentioned, Hillary. Like for you, the act of giving is to, you know, restore what was once stolen or taken away. And it really like sparked a thought in my head, because when I think about our practice of philanthropy, is that what, you know, our philanthropy practices and systems have been designed to do, to restore what was taken? And I ask that in sincerity because my own experience with philanthropy has been, you know, it's a tool to help protect and preserve wealth. So there's this like, you know, tension with these opposing dichotomies. So I'd love to either Hillary or someone else kind of expand on that thought.
Well, I mean, I don't know if folks have had a chance to read the report that just came out, I think last year, called Gilded Philanthropy, talking about how philanthropy is being, you know, helping to perpetuate a lot of the inequalities that we're facing, because you have people parking their money that is allegedly going to fundraising into family foundations and donor advised funds, and that they're not going into the communities that they need. And so it's another form of power in addition to, so I think there's definitely that tension where we're seeing, you know, these mega gifts coming in and shaping our philanthropic landscape at a time when we're having increasing inequality, and people who, you know, the annual givers, you know, folks who aren't giving those millions or even thousands of dollars of gifts are dropping off. So you're seeing, you know, it's helping to perpetuate the problems that we're seeing. And then those gifts are helping to further shape the country in the way that the people who have the money, you know, could go even further. So, and that can change, you know, going back to, you know, whether accepting money, is that shaping missions and, you know, making scope creep. So it's a pretty devastating report, and I highly recommend we all check it out.
Thank you.
I can share that I think I saw somebody in the chat asking how did you come to that conclusion, and about returning resources. And for me, it's just been really being part of Indigenous-led community work and having really strong relationships, and Indigenous mentors in particular has taught me so much. I really owe a lot to that community, because there's a certain level of pathology present in being a philanthropist affiliated with an institution. You know, there's a pathology there, like you said, James, around it's really about perpetuating wealth. It's not about actually getting rid of that wealth and letting that wealth flow and as it should, and flow back to the sources from which it was taken. So I think those of us who are in these positions of moving money in the philanthropic world, we really need to be looking at ourselves and doing our healing work. And a lot of that healing comes through relationship. And just really, really trying to be honest with ourselves about the foundations of how this whole setup came to be in the first place.
Yes. James, I know that we're getting close to time, and I understand that Giselle might come on and talk a little bit about their matrix. Is that right?
Hi, yes, I'm happy to. And I just wanted to thank you for giving me space. I'm the VP of Development at an organization called Health Leads. And one of the reasons that I'll share my screen, and hopefully my daughter won't walk in. But one of the reasons, there it is. One of the reasons my organization and team decided to create this checklist is because we had a very diverse team, maybe even 80% people of color on the development team, which is very rare. But the 3 staff members that were working on development, content, and communications were all white women. And we were very concerned about the perspective and how content would be shaped and shared just with their lack of perspective and lived experience in communities of color. And so the entire team developed this DEI checklist, which really is meant to slow down the content creation process, And it's a series of questions that go from, you'll see ideation and brainstorming, just when you're starting to develop content, all the way down to an acknowledgement statement at the end saying, to the best of my abilities, I have reviewed the DEI checklist against the, whatever content we're publishing or putting out there. And I'm absolutely happy to share this. And I highlighted a few questions that I thought, were sort of examples of what are the things we ask ourselves before, when we create it and when we publish. It'll be things like, how is the content sourced? Are we sharing this in the first person or third person? If it's in the third person, why? Why is that perspective important, and why are we not sharing it in the first person? Other things, have we selected the person closest to the work to tell the story? If not, why? Let's see, what else did I pull out? Are we over relying on a particular perspective? So one of the things that we've encountered all the time, and the teams I've worked on, we always rely on a handful of people or a handful of stories, and then those folks end up being just overtaxed and overburdened in the name of amplifying voices. And so really thinking about, are we over relying and putting the burden on our communities of color? And things like, are we, common sense questions, but you have to sort of stop and ask yourself, are we perpetuating negative stereotypes or tired tropes? Does this amplify the perspectives of people most deeply impacted or those closest to the work? And if not, why? So all of these are yes, no. If not, interrogate further whether we're doing the right stuff. And it's not perfect, and I don't know that it's applicable to every piece of content, but it was certainly our way of making sure that we were doing our own internal due diligence, because I think, as someone had mentioned, maybe it was Michelle, we do have a lot of power as fundraisers and communicators, and what we put out there is what our donors are reading.
That's right. This is so awesome.
I'm gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing this. We're getting a lot of really great comments in the chat for this resource. And maybe it's a great way to just wrap things up, because that was our hope in convening a lot of like-minded thought leaders around fundraising, is we need to collectively really evaluate what racism does to our sector, especially to fundraisers and to philanthropists. So I'm glad that we're able to come together, at least today, to continue this conversation. I do have an announcement before we wrap up, but in our next virtual session, we will be specifically inviting anyone who is interested in hosting or starting their own local community-centric fundraising chapter. We here in Seattle have been really fortunate to have the support and resources to convene these types of dialogues and to convene, a website to collect these blog posts and these thought pieces. But we also don't want to control everything. We certainly don't want to gatekeep. And we think there's a big opportunity for movement building and seeing more local communities and local chapters kind of spring up to own this and really make it your own. So be on the lookout for that email. We will send it out to everyone who's signed up today and to anyone who's on our mailing list. But that is coming. And I want to let you all know right now that it's something we're actively trying to do, is respond to the question of how do you start a local chapter. So that is it. And I want to take a moment again to thank all of our panelists here today for sharing your time and your thoughts and your energy. Any closing words? If not, I'm happy to wrap it up. Is that Erica wrapping? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you have.
James, we lost you for a moment there.
Oh,
I can.
Sorry.
Oh, you're back or not? I'm not sure.
I can't tell.
Okay, I can hear you again. Good.
Oh, I am back. Okay. Great. Well, I think all I said was thank you, everyone, and hope you have a great Monday. Enjoy the rest of your week. Right, and thank you to all our guests for joining us.
Okay, and for all all people who are here who submitted their email address, we will send a follow-up email and we'll have the link to the documents that we shared today in that email.
Also,
Thanks,
I just wanted to
everybody.
thank everybody for all those amazing questions. I'm really sorry we didn't get to more of them. There were some really good ones in there. So thank you all for participating and for keeping us going. We're here to support you and hope that we've been able to support you, but just know that that goes both ways and you're supporting us by being here. Thank you.
And I see that question from Colin, maybe an article with leftover questions. Boo, we have like 500 questions. So I definitely invite anybody to save the chat and look at those questions, or save the Q&A and look at those questions, and feel free to write an article addressing any question that you feel passionate about, or send us an email at hello@community-centric-fundraising.org, and eventually we will read that email, and we can also look for content creators, but I think it's best sourced from this community. Same goes for Giselle. If you want to share that out, the DEI checklist that your team created, there's a lot of interest here, so please get a hold of us if you'd like to share it out to everybody. And for everyone on this call, just know you too can create content for the Content Hub. You're invited.
I see a lot of people putting their email addresses in the chat. I think we need those to be registered on our mailing list. Is that right?
That's
Instead
right.
of putting your email address in the chat, sign up for our mailing list.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, so I think we're officially done. Okay.
Great.
Awesome. Good job, y'all.
Thanks, everybody. Mark, are you closing us out?
Yes, I will end for everybody.
That was super fun, you guys. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I
So the
wish
chat
someone
is saved. The Q&As are saved.
Cool.
We've recorded the whole meeting, so whatever was said is saved.
We can probably stop recording now.
And we can stop recording now.
And have the real talk.
Everyone left. 100 people left on the phone. This is the real one.
Yeah.
I mean, not